dear Secretary General, dear Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, it goes without saying that it's a great honor and immense pleasure to address you today. The IDU gathers political parties from the 5 continents, and however, we all come here like we would go to the family meeting. Because we are all united by common values. We strongly believe in the universality of democracy and human rights. We prefer big societies to heavy bureaucracies. We consider free individuals before paying attention to social classes or ethnic or other groups. We stand firm in our belief that open economies are the basis of global growth and prosperity rather than socialism and isolationism. To sum up, we are cherishing the core principles of liberal democratic systems generated in this very country several centuries ago. There is, ladies and gentlemen, no better place for our family to gather than in London. When I was living in a captive nation, enslaved by the Soviet regime, I was obliged to study at school how English philosophers and economists have been rebuked by the glorious figures of the Marxist dialectics. Deep in my heart, as a vast majority of my compatriots, I knew it was a blatant lie, and I kept dreaming both about England, the country that had been able to produce such principles, and about the time when my own nation would finally have access to them. And exactly 20 years ago, the Soviet Union collapsed, unleashing the dreams of dozens and hundreds of millions. It was clearly not the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, as the ex and very much future Russian president has put it in an interesting moment of a nostalgic honesty. But it was not either the end of history, as some observers have described it here in the West. It was for all of us who were born on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, a new beginning of the contrary. A long and difficult road was ahead of us before we could finally reintegrate the family of free and democratic nations. Ladies and gentlemen, 80 years ago, Georgia was still a failed state, a criminalized and corrupt society, suffocated by authoritarian structures of poverty. 8 years ago, our people took to the streets in the name of the very principles that we are gathering us today. They took the streets and brought a new generation to power, a generation that has turned Georgia into a regional laboratory for reforms. Despite occupation, we basically are building our democracy in Camp Point. Georgia has turned into an experimental lab for liberal reforms. We scrapped 90% of our licenses and regulations. We scrapped almost half of government agencies, half the number of government bureaucrats. And and for the last 7 years, in nominal terms, Georgian economy has more than tripled. Poverty has decreased from 52% down to 17%. Georgia has become second or third least corrupt country in Europe, according to the EBRD, with the trust and confidence in institutions at par with Nordic countries in Europe. We have second most efficient and transparent bureaucracy in the world, according to the Canadian Centre of Law and Democracy, based on Transparency International data, in the world after New Zealand. And we turned out to be from the most criminalized society in Europe into the safest country in Europe, based on the last 4 EU surveys that study data Europe-wide. And that's... So what it really shows to me is that both courage of reformers and freedom coupled with each other work in a very efficient way. Georgia is a message of hope for the region and for also the Arab world. And today here I want to benefit from the fact that I just met with the Prime Minister, but he is here, and it goes beyond the borders of this great country, what this government is trying to do here in the UK. I think this is what you've done internally, David, but especially also what you've done on Libya. I think Libya has reminded all of us, especially us like countries that are aspiring to become European, to go closer to the European structures, to Euro-Atlantic community, that this structure, that this continent is not about, it's not about history of bureaucracy. It's not about history of European Commission's directives only, or sometimes a very difficult world to comprehend of how it works. But it's all about the history of politics and above all political leadership. I think David Cameron has demonstrated an amazing example of Churchill-style political leadership at the moment when Europe and the world needed it most of all in Libya and in recent times. So I really wanted to thank you for that, because ultimately that's what will bring the world forward. Not just the polls, what they say in the last week, or what's the zero risk and zero politics, which all of us learn to play when you are talking and fighting for elections all the time, and that's normal in a democratic society. But there is something beyond that that should bring the world to become a better place. And that's exactly what we learned. And I think that's so important that these principles apply after Arab Spring. That principles apply in newly liberated Libya. That principles apply to all of us that are trying to break out from the cold and come to a more civilized, open-minded, freer societies. Again, thank you for all that, and thank you for your attention. It's amazing.